Imagine this. You're driving down a dark, empty road in the middle of the night. The only sound is the hum of your engine, and the only light comes from your headlights cutting through the blackness. Suddenly, you spot something or someone that shouldn't be there. Night drives may feel peaceful, but for some, they've turned into terrifying encounters that haunt them forever. Tonight, we're diving into 3 very creepy true night drive horror stories that will make you think twice before hitting the road after dark. The first chapter begins on a long stretch of highway that seemed to have no end, a place where silence pressed down heavier than the night sky itself. It was the kind of road that drivers dreaded, but had to take when they had no other option, a rural route that wound through empty fields and pockets of woods, far from towns or even scattered farmhouses. The only company for the driver was the faint crackle of the radio and the glow of the dashboard lights. The clock ticked past midnight, and with each mile, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the road ahead until only the sharp beam of the headlights carved a narrow path forward. The driver was exhausted, his eyes heavy from the long journey, but he pressed on, hoping to reach the next town before fatigue forced him to pull over. The air outside was still, too still, as though the world around him had gone into hiding. The road was so empty that when the driver glanced into his rearview mirror, the endless black behind him looked like a void, a place where nothing could possibly exist. Yet, despite the emptiness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. After a while, the monotony of the drive was broken by something unusual ahead. At first it appeared faint, almost like a smudge against the roadside. As the car drew closer, the shape began to take form, and the driver leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. There was a figure walking along the shoulder of the highway, barely illuminated by the pale glow of the headlights. The figure was small and delicate, and as the driver passed, the light revealed the outline of a young woman dressed in white. Her clothes looked out of place, more like an old-fashioned dress than anything modern, and she walked slowly, her arms hanging limply at her sides. The driver's heart skipped a beat. The highway was miles from any house, and no one should have been there at this hour. He slowed down, torn between the instinct to keep driving and the nagging thought that maybe she needed help. For a moment he convinced himself to stop, telling himself that he couldn't just leave someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. He pulled onto the shoulder a few feet ahead of her, and rolled down the passenger side window, calling out into the night. His voice sounded too loud, echoing unnaturally in the emptiness. The girl didn't answer. When she finally lifted her head, her face looked pale and tired, her eyes wide and glassy as though she hadn't slept in days. The driver offered her a ride, and after a pause, she silently nodded and opened the door. She climbed in without a word, sitting stiffly in the seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The air in the car grew colder, so much so that the driver shivered, though the heater was on. He tried to ask her questions, where she was headed, if she was all right, but she barely responded, her voice soft, almost like a whisper, and her gaze fixed on the darkness outside the window. The car moved steadily along the highway, its headlights stretching into the emptiness, yet the silence inside felt heavier than before. The girl in white sat motionless, her profile lit faintly by the dashboard glow, her eyes distant and unreadable. The driver tried again to spark conversation, asking if she had family nearby, or if she needed to call someone, but her replies were so faint they almost blended into the hum of the engine. It was as if she was speaking to herself rather than to him. The strangeness of her presence gnawed at him, yet Petty kept him from pushing harder. He told himself she must be in shock, maybe from being stranded out here, maybe from something worse, but the questions formed in his mind faster than he could reason them away. Minutes passed, and the road wound deeper into nowhere. The driver noticed that the temperature inside the car remained unnaturally cold, no matter how high he turned the heat. His breath even began to fog slightly, something that shouldn't have been possible in late summer. He glanced toward her again, and for an instant, under the flicker of passing road signs, her reflection in the window looked different. Her eyes seemed darker, hollow like empty sockets. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced once more by her quiet, pale face staring into the night. He gripped the wheel tighter, forcing himself to stay calm, telling himself it was just the fatigue of driving too late at night. Trying to ground himself, he asked her where she wanted him to drop her off. Slowly, she turned her head toward him, and for the first time since she had entered the car, she looked directly into his eyes. There was something unsettling about the intensity of her stare, something that made the hair on his arms rise. After a pause, she whispered an address, a location that seemed oddly familiar. The driver realized with a chill that it was in the next town, a place he had driven through a handful of times, though he couldn't recall ever meeting her. He nodded quickly, relieved to finally have a destination, but unease lingered. As the car continued forward, the girl's behavior grew stranger. She began humming softly under her breath, a faint, tuneless melody that didn't sound quite right, the kind of sound that made the silence feel even more oppressive. At times, he thought he heard words hidden within the hum, but whenever he strained to listen, it dissolved back into vague notes. He tried to distract himself by focusing on the road, yet his eyes were drawn to her every few minutes, worried he might see that hollow reflection again. The headlights eventually picked up a sign indicating that the town was close. Relief flickered through him, but it was cut short when he realized that the girl was no longer sitting upright. Slowly, she leaned against the passenger window, her figure slumping as though overcome with exhaustion. He opened his mouth to ask if she was all right, but when he looked closer, his chest tightened. Her skin looked paler than before, almost translucent, and her breathing, if it was happening at all, could not be heard over the steady drone of the engine. The driver's hands tightened around the wheel, his knuckles pale as he dared a glance at the figure beside him. The girl's head rested against the glass, her face half lit by the passing beams of light, and she seemed unnaturally still. He slowed the car slightly, debating whether to pull over and check on her, but something deep inside urged him not to stop on that empty stretch of road. Instead, he kept driving, his pulse quickening as the address she had whispered earlier edged closer. The silence was suffocating now, and every second stretched longer than the last. The engine hummed steadily, the only sound filling the car, yet he felt as if the air itself had grown heavy, pressing down on his chest. Finally, he saw the turnoff that led into the small town, a collection of dim streetlights glowing faintly in the distance. He turned onto the narrow road, feeling a flicker of hope that the bizarre journey was almost over. The houses were sparse here, their windows dark, as if the entire neighborhood was asleep. He slowed as he searched for the address, counting faded numbers on old mailboxes, until he reached the one she had given him. Pulling into the cracked driveway, he let the car idle and turned to tell her they had arrived, his voice caught in his throat. The passenger seat was empty. The girl who had been beside him for the past half hour was gone. The door hadn't opened, and he hadn't heard a sound, but there was no trace of her. The seatbelt lay slack, untouched, and the air still felt icy cold, as if she had left her presence behind. His heart hammered, and for several moments he sat frozen, unable to move, staring at the vacant seat. Logic battled with fear, and he scrambled for explanations. Had exhaustion played tricks on him? Had he imagined her completely, or had she somehow slipped away without him noticing? Gathering what courage he had, he stepped out of the car. The night air was sharp and carried with it the faint scent of damp earth. The house before him was an old one, its paint faded and the porch light long dead. He hesitated before walking to the door, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Finally, he knocked, each rap echoing louder than he intended. After a pause, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman stood there, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp with curiosity. The driver cleared his throat, unsure of how to explain himself, but he managed to ask if a young woman lived there, describing the girl in white as best he could. The woman's expression changed slowly, her eyes widening with something between recognition and sorrow. After a long silence, she told him that her daughter had lived there once, many years ago, but she had died tragically in a car accident on that very highway late at night, dressed in her favorite white dress, trying to make her way home. The second story begins with another long stretch of road, but this time the atmosphere is different. It isn't the silence of a country highway, but the uneasy emptiness of a state road that cuts through dark forests and winding hills. The driver, a young man heading home after visiting friends, had taken this road many times before. It was late, close to midnight, and traffic had thinned until his car was the only vehicle in sight. The steady rhythm of tires against the asphalt was almost soothing at first, but that calm quickly shifted when he glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed a pair of headlights in the distance. At first, he thought nothing of it, someone else traveling late just like him, but the feeling of unease grew as the lights drew closer. He kept driving at a steady pace, not too fast and not too slow, but the headlights stayed locked behind him, neither overtaking nor falling back. They trailed him like a shadow, their beams glaring against his mirrors. Minutes passed, and the road remained empty except for his car and the one tailing him. A tight knot began forming in his stomach. He switched lanes to see if the car would pass, but it didn't. Instead, the black silhouette followed every movement, hugging his lane as if tethered to him. The driver's pulse quickened, his palms growing damp against the steering wheel. He tapped the brakes lightly, slowing down to test the other car's behavior, but it mirrored him perfectly, keeping the same distance. For a moment, he considered pulling over at the next turnout, but the thought of stopping while that dark vehicle loomed behind sent a shiver down his spine. He tried to convince himself it was just coincidence, that maybe the other driver was nervous about passing on a dark road. Yet deep down he sensed something was wrong. As the miles stretched on, the pursuit became impossible to ignore. The black car's headlights glared relentlessly, and no matter how the driver adjusted his speed, it refused to leave. The forest pressed close on both sides of the road, its tall trees blotting out the sky, making the world feel even smaller. The driver turned up the radio in a desperate attempt to distract himself, but every beat of the music only heightened his awareness of the car behind. It was as if the road had narrowed into a tunnel, trapping him in this silent chase with no escape. When a sign for a small town appeared in the distance, a spark of hope lit within him. If he could make it to civilization, to streetlights and people, he would feel safe again. He pressed down on the accelerator, urging his car faster. For a moment, the black car fell slightly back, and he thought maybe it was finally over, but then its headlights flared brighter, accelerating to match his speed. The chase continued, the two vehicles locked together in the darkness, and the young man realized with growing dread that the black car wasn't just following him. It was hunting him. The road curved sharply as the young man gripped the steering wheel, his heart racing faster than the car itself. The black vehicle behind him stuck close, its headlights so bright they almost blinded him through the mirrors. He tried weaving between lanes, slowing down, then speeding up again, but every move he made was mirrored perfectly, as though the other driver was playing a cruel game. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by looming trees that cast long shadows across the asphalt. No gas stations, no houses, not even a passing truck appeared to break the tension. It was just him, the darkness, and the relentless glow of those two lights. Desperation began to gnaw at him. He rolled down his window, letting the cold air sting his face, hoping the rush of wind would help him focus. The thought of pulling over flickered in his mind again, but every instinct screamed against it. Whoever was in that black car wanted him isolated, vulnerable. Stopping might mean handing himself over. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the needle on the speedometer climbed, but the black car answered instantly, surging forward to close the gap. It stayed unnervingly close, never falling too far behind, never drawing near enough to pass. The young man's nerves frayed as minutes stretched into an eternity. He honked his horn, slammed on the brakes suddenly to try to throw the pursuer off, but nothing changed. The car reacted as if it could read his mind, anticipating his every move. Panic rose in his chest, tightening like a vice, and he began to realize this wasn't just a reckless driver. It felt deliberate, calculated. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, stunned to see how much time had passed since the chase began. What should have been a short drive had turned into a nightmare with no exit. The road dipped into a stretch where the trees thinned, revealing open land under the pale glow of the moon. For the first time, he thought he might be able to get a better look at the car itself. He pushed harder, pulling far enough ahead to see the shape behind him clearly. His eyes locked on the rearview mirror, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The car was completely black, its windows darker than night, no reflection of a driver, no hint of movement inside. It was as if the car itself was alive, an empty shell with nothing human controlling it. His chest tightened with dread, yet he couldn't look away. The vehicle's headlights flared brighter, almost unnaturally bright, flooding the road with harsh white beams. The young man blinked against the glare, but when his vision cleared, the car was even closer than before, its grille nearly kissing his rear bumper. He gritted his teeth, knuckles aching on the wheel, and realized with a chilling certainty that this wasn't going to end like a normal drive. The young man's pulse thudded in his ears as the black car pressed closer, its headlights blazing with an intensity that made it impossible to see the road clearly. He leaned forward over the wheel, every muscle in his body tense, guiding his car through the dark curves as if the smallest mistake would mean the end. The forested road offered no escape, no safe shoulder to pull onto, only endless asphalt stretching ahead and the relentless presence behind him. The chase had gone on so long that it felt less like a pursuit and more like a ritual, as though the black car was waiting for something, forcing him deeper into the night. He tried to focus on small details, the mile markers flashing past, the sound of his tires gripping the road, the faint vibration of the steering wheel. But his concentration kept snapping back to the glare in his mirror. His eyes burned, exhaustion creeping in, but fear kept him sharp. He knew he couldn't keep driving like this forever. His gas tank was edging toward empty, the needle trembling close to the red, and the thought of stalling with that thing behind him filled him with a terror he had never known. He pressed the accelerator harder, trying to put distance between them. But each time he gained a few precious feet. The black car surged forward again, never letting him go. When the road finally began to slope upward into a winding hill, he felt a flicker of hope. If he could take the curves fast enough, maybe he could lose it. He tightened his grip and leaned into the bends, his tires squealing as he pushed his car to its limit. The headlights behind wavered slightly as the black car followed, but it never fell too far back. Each sharp turn was a gamble. The young man half convinced his car would skid off the road, but adrenaline forced him onward. He could feel the sweat dripping down his back, the shiver of cold fear mixing with the heat of exertion. At the crest of the hill, the landscape opened up into a valley. The faint glow of a small town appeared in the distance, a scatter of orange streetlights that looked like salvation. His chest lifted with desperate relief as he aimed his car toward that faint light, but the black car refused to break off. It followed him down the hill, its beams flaring brighter than ever, washing over his car until the road in front blurred into pale streaks. He fought to stay centered, fighting the urge to look back, knowing if he did, he might lose control completely. As he neared the town, the headlights behind him began to flicker strangely. At first, it seemed like a trick of the road, but then the beams pulsed unnaturally, dimming and flaring as though the car itself was shuddering. His breath caught as he realized the vehicle wasn't just following anymore. It was closing in, faster than ever, bearing down with a force that felt impossible to outrun. The third story begins with the sound of tires crunching over gravel as a lone traveler pulled into a nearly deserted gas station on the outskirts of town. It was past 2 in the morning, the kind of hour when the world feels emptied of life, and the fluorescent lights above the pumps buzzed faintly against the silence. The man driving had been on the road for hours, his body aching from fatigue, and the sight of the small rest stop had brought him a sense of relief. He parked near one of the pumps, cut the engine, and for a moment simply sat in the stillness, listening to the faint ticking of the cooling car. The station looked old, worn down by time. Paint peeled from the edges of the building, and a flickering neon sign cast a pale, sickly glow across the lot. Only one other car sat nearby, a beat-up sedan parked awkwardly near the convenience store entrance. Its windows were so dark that he couldn't see inside, and there was no movement to suggest anyone was there. The emptiness unsettled him, though he tried to shake the feeling as he stepped out and began fueling his car. The night air was cold, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made him pull his jacket tighter. As he stood there, eyes heavy with exhaustion, he noticed movement near the edge of the lot. A figure stood by the pump opposite his, half in shadow, watching quietly. At first, he thought it might be another late night traveler, but something about the way the person stood, too still, too silent, sent a chill crawling down his spine. The figure didn't seem to be fueling a car. In fact, there was no vehicle beside them at all. They simply lingered, heads slightly tilted, their posture strange and unnatural. The man avoided eye contact, focusing on the numbers climbing on the pump, but he could feel the weight of that gaze pressing against him. He tried to tell himself he was imagining it, that he was too tired and jumpy, but when he finally glanced back, the figure was still there, closer now, as though they had shifted without making a sound. Their clothes hung oddly, dark and shapeless, and their face was obscured by the shadows cast by the buzzing lights overhead. Finishing as quickly as he could, he replaced the nozzle and climbed back into his car, locking the doors with a sharp click. He sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead, his heart thudding in his chest. When he finally dared to look back toward the other pump, the figure was gone. The space was empty, as if no one had ever been standing there. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but even as he prepared to pull away, the uneasy sense of being watched refused to leave him. The man gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pulled away from the gas station, his eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the mirrors. The lot behind him grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the night, but the unease remained, wrapping itself around him like a second skin. The stretch of road beyond the station was even more isolated, a two-lane highway that cut through dense woods, with no streetlights and only the pale beams of his headlights to keep the darkness at bay. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint thud of his heartbeat in his ears. He tried to convince himself he was simply overtired, that the strange figure at the station had been nothing more than another late traveler, but the thought rang hollow in his mind. The forest loomed closer as the road narrowed, the trees crowding in on either side, their branches arching overhead like skeletal arms. Shadows shifted in the underbrush, though each time he looked directly at them, they vanished, leaving only the stillness of the night. He tightened his grip on the wheel and pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and that gas station. Yet, no matter how far he drove, he couldn't shake the prickling sensation that he was not alone. Glancing into the rearview mirror, he froze. At first, it was just the faint outline of something in the distance, but then it became clearer. A figure standing directly in the middle of the road behind him, illuminated for only a moment by the glow of his taillights before the darkness swallowed it up. His stomach dropped, and he shook his head, telling himself it wasn't real. That exhaustion was blurring his vision, but the dread only grew heavier. The woods seemed to close in tighter the further he went, and soon, the sensation of being followed turned unbearable. Every bend in the road made him expect to see someone waiting, just beyond the reach of his headlights. He switched on the radio in an effort to drown out his nerves, but the speakers hissed with static, the sound sharp and grating, until he quickly shut it off. The silence afterward felt even worse, as though the world was holding its breath. A few miles later, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The faint reflection of movement flickered across the passenger side window. His heart leapt, and he snapped his head to the side, but the seat beside him was empty. Still, he couldn't shake the impression that someone, or something, was pacing him just outside, matching the speed of his car as he drove. The air inside the vehicle felt icy, far colder than it had been minutes ago, and no adjustment of the vents made any difference. His breathing grew shallow, each inhale laced with fear, as he fought the urge to slam on the brakes and flee into the woods, knowing deep down that whatever was keeping pace with him wasn't bound by the rules of the road, stretched endlessly ahead, twisting deeper into the forest, while the man's nerves unraveled with each passing mile. He could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against him, a presence that grew stronger the further he drove. His headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, but the shadows beyond seemed to move and breathe as if alive. The sense of being followed was no longer just a fleeting fear, it had rooted itself into every part of him. He pressed harder on the gas, desperate to escape, but no matter how quickly he sped through the night, the dread clung to him like a shadow that refused to let go. The silence was broken when he thought he heard footsteps, echoing faintly alongside the car, quick and steady, as though something was running just outside his window. He snapped his head to the side, but the trees flew past in a blur, nothing visible among the trunks. Yet the sound lingered in his mind, impossible to shake. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, and his breath came faster, shallow and ragged. He tried to remind himself that it couldn't be real, that no person could keep up with a moving car, but deep down he knew this was not something human. As the road dipped downward into a hollow, the faint outline of a rest area appeared. A small clearing with a wooden sign, a few picnic tables, and a dim light post that flickered weakly against the dark. Relief washed through him at the thought of stepping into someplace solid, but as he slowed and pulled into the gravel lot, his relief curdled into fear. The clearing was empty, yet it didn't feel empty. The woods pressed close on all sides, their branches bending toward the lot as if trying to swallow it whole. The lone light flickered once, twice, then buzzed faintly, casting jagged shadows across the ground. He killed the engine, but the silence that followed was unbearable, as though the entire forest was listening. For a long moment he sat motionless, staring out at the trees, waiting for something to emerge. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement near the edge of the lot. A dark shape stood just beyond the reach of the light, still and silent. His chest tightened, and though every instinct told him to drive away, he found himself leaning forward, straining to see. The shape didn't move, didn't breathe, just lingered, its presence heavier than the air itself. The man fumbled for his keys with trembling hands, but before he could restart the car, the figure stepped forward. The weak light revealed only fragments, pale skin, a gaunt outline, eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. His pulse thundered in his ears, his body frozen in place, as the figure moved closer with slow, deliberate steps that crunched against the gravel, each one dragging him deeper into the nightmare that had been following him since the gas station. The figure inched closer with every step, and the man's fear spiraled into panic. His mind screamed for him to move, to start the car and escape, but his body felt as though it had been locked in place by invisible chains. The gravel crunched steadily, each sound louder than the last, echoing in the night air. The flickering light above swayed slightly in the breeze, illuminating the figure just enough to reveal the hollow, unnatural look in its eyes. They didn't shine like the eyes of any living thing. They glowed faintly, almost as if light was seeping out of an empty void. Finally, adrenaline surged through him, and he snapped out of his frozen terror. His hands fumbled with the keys, the metal slipping against his sweaty palms, before he jammed them into the ignition and twisted hard. The car roared to life, and in that moment the figure halted, standing motionless just a few feet from the driver's side door. For a split second, their eyes met. The man felt a sharp chill course through his body, as though the figure's gaze had pierced directly into his soul. Then instinct took over. He slammed the gear into drive, tires spinning on the gravel, before shooting forward onto the empty road. His heart pounded furiously as he sped away from the rest stop. The forest loomed once more, its branches whipping by as he pushed the car faster and faster, desperate to leave everything behind. But the sense of being pursued returned instantly, stronger than ever. He didn't dare look in the mirror, terrified of what he might see. The only thought that guided him was the faint glow of the town still miles ahead, a promise of safety he wasn't sure he would reach. Minutes stretched endlessly as he fought to keep control of the wheel. His mind replayed the encounter again and again, the hollow eyes, the stillness, the way the figure had appeared without a sound. He knew with bone, deep certainty that it hadn't been human. Something had followed him from the gas station, something that thrived in the dark stretches of lonely highways. As the forest finally began to thin, and the first scattered streetlights came into view, he felt the pressure around him begin to lift. The air inside the car warmed slightly, and the oppressive weight on his chest eased just enough for him to breathe again. When he crossed into the town, he slowed for the first time in what felt like hours. Streetlights bathed the road in a comforting orange glow, and the sight of quiet houses, lined neatly along the street, gave him a fragile sense of safety. He pulled into a convenience store parking lot, cut the engine, and sat in silence, his hands trembling against the steering wheel. He forced himself to check the mirrors, to look behind him. The road stretched empty under the glow of the lamps. The figure was gone. Still, the sense of unease didn't fade entirely. Deep down, he knew what he had encountered would linger with him for the rest of his life. He would never again drive at night without thinking of those hollow eyes, that silent pursuit. To this day, he avoids late night drives altogether, and when asked why, he simply answers with a haunted look, unwilling to relive the memory in words. And so ends the third story, closing a collection of 3 true tales from the road, each a reminder of how quickly an ordinary night drive can turn into something chilling, something unforgettable. Some stories speak of ghosts, others of dark entities that follow, and some remain mysteries that can never be explained. But one thing remains certain: the road at night holds secrets, and sometimes those secrets choose to reveal themselves to the wrong traveler. Thank you for joining me through these very creepy true night drive horror stories. If you've ever felt uneasy on an empty road, or sensed that someone was watching you when no one was there, these stories might just explain why. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the scariest things happen when the world seems the most quiet. Thank you for watching, and until next time, drive carefully, especially at night,